I want to be precise about this. I want to lay it out the way it actually happened, not the way it felt, because the way it felt is unreliable. I know that now. I knew it then, too, somewhere underneath everything. But I had a rule, and rules are comfortable. Rules let you stop thinking. That was the problem. I took the position in early November, overwintering caretaker for a research station on the northern shore of Lake Saginaga, just below the Canadian border in Minnesota, the Boundary Waters. If you haven't been there, it's difficult to describe the quality of the silence. It isn't the absence of sound exactly. It's more like the presence of something that isn't sound, a pressure that fills the space where noise should be. In the summer, the area is trafficked by canoeists, researchers, outfitters, but by November the water is too cold, the portages are iced, and everything human pulls back south like a tide going out. What remains is the station, the forest, the lake, and the kind of darkness that has weight. The station itself was a two-story timber frame building, constructed in the late 80s as a base for a long-term ecological monitoring project run through the University of Minnesota Duluth. The ground floor held the lab, a storage room, a small kitchen, and a main room with a wood stove. Upstairs were 2 bedrooms and a bathroom with plumbing that worked when the pipes weren't frozen. The whole thing sat about 40 yards from the lakeshore, backed up against a stand of old-growth red pine. There was a dock. There was a generator shed. There was a gravel track that connected to a forest road that connected eventually to the Gunflint Trail, which was the nearest paved surface, about 14 miles southeast. I was hired to maintain the building, monitor the weather instruments, log temperature and precipitation data, and keep the generator in working order through the winter. The actual research team would return in May. I would be alone from November 15th to May 1st. That was the job. I'd done similar things before. 2 winters at a fire lookout in Idaho, a season at a biological field station in the Upper Peninsula. I was not a person who was afraid of isolation. I want to be clear about that. My orientation was conducted by a man named Dale Torvik, who was the station's operations manager. Dale was in his 60s, methodical, not particularly warm. He drove me up from Grand Marais on November 12th and spent 3 days walking me through the systems: the generator, the weather instruments, the radio, the water pump, the wood stove. He showed me where the firewood was stacked. He showed me the backup fuel. He showed me the emergency cache, which included a satellite phone, a first aid kit, and a binder. The binder was thick, maybe 200 pages, and it covered every contingency Dale could imagine: generator failure procedures, pipe freeze protocols, wildlife encounter guidelines, radio check-in schedules. I was to radio in to the Forest Service office in Grand Marais every Tuesday and Friday at 8 in the morning. If I missed 2 consecutive check-ins without explanation, they would send someone. Otherwise, I was on my own. On the last page of the binder, after the appendices, after the equipment manuals, after everything else, there was a single sheet of paper. It was different from the rest of the binder. The binder pages were printed on standard white copy paper, laser printed, formatted with headers and bullet points and page numbers. This last page was older. It was on heavier stock, slightly yellowed, and the text was typewritten, not printed. The font was uneven in the way typewriter fonts are, where some letters strike harder than others. The ribbon had been wearing thin when it was typed because the text was faint in places, almost ghostly, and darker in others where the key had been struck twice or where the letter happened to fall on a fresher part of the ribbon. It read, Winter Caretaker Supplemental Guidelines, effective November 1989. And beneath that, a short list. Most of the items were mundane. Keep the exterior lights off between 11 at night and 5 in the morning to avoid disrupting wildlife patterns. Do not store food in the upstairs bedrooms. Keep the main floor doors locked after dark. And then, the last item. If knocking is heard at the exterior door after dark, do not answer if it knocks twice. 2 knocks in succession means do not open the door. Any other pattern, you may use your judgment, but do not answer 2 knocks. That was it. No elaboration, no context, no explanation of what might knock or why 2 knocks were significant. Just the instruction. I read it, and I looked at Dale, and I think I actually smiled. I asked him what it was about. He said it had been in the binder since before he started. He said it was probably something a previous caretaker added, maybe a joke, maybe a superstition. He said the station was old, and old places collect rituals. He said I could ignore it if I wanted. Then he said, but I wouldn't open the door at night anyway, if I were you. Not because of the note, just because it's the boundary waters in winter. There's nothing out there you need to meet in the dark. That was sensible enough. I didn't think about the note again for almost 2 weeks. Dale left on the morning of November 15th. I watched his truck go down the gravel track until the trees swallowed it. Then there was silence. That particular silence. And I was alone. The first 12 days were beautiful. The weather was cold but not extreme. Highs in the upper 20s, lows around 10. I fell into a routine quickly. I woke at 6, started the wood stove, made coffee, ate breakfast. At 7:30, I checked the weather instruments and logged the data. I did maintenance tasks in the morning, whatever needed doing, splitting wood, checking the generator, clearing the gravel track. In the afternoon, I read. I'd brought a large duffel of books, mostly history, some fiction. In the evening, I cooked, ate, read more, and was usually in bed by 9:30. The days were short. By 4:30 it was dark, and by 5 it was the kind of dark that feels absolute. I want to describe the door because it matters. The main entrance to the station was on the east side, facing the lake. It was a heavy door, solid core, set in a wooden frame that had swollen and contracted over the years so that the fit was slightly imperfect. When the wind came off the lake, you could feel it in the gap at the bottom of the door. The door had a deadbolt and a chain. On the outside, there was a small wooden landing, 2 steps down to the ground. There was no porch light. The nearest exterior light was on the corner of the building, about 15 feet away, and I kept it off at night per the guidelines. On November 27th, at approximately 8:40 in the evening, I heard a knock at the door. I was sitting in the main room. The wood stove was going. I was reading a book about the construction of the Erie Canal. The knock was singular. 1 knock. Not loud, not soft. A mid-weight knock. The kind a person makes when they're not sure someone is home and they don't want to be rude. It came from the main door. It was distinct. It was not the wind. It was not a branch. It was a knock. I put the book down. I sat still and listened. Nothing followed. No second knock. No voice. No footsteps. I waited probably 3 minutes, which is a long time to sit perfectly still and listen to silence. Then I got up and went to the door. I did not open it. I looked through the small window beside the door. The window was old single-pane glass, and it was dark outside, so all I could see was a vague reflection of the room behind me, and, beyond that, the slightly lighter darkness of the snow-covered ground. I couldn't see the landing clearly. I couldn't see anything on it. I went back to my chair. I thought about it for a while. Then I thought about the note in the binder. The note said, "Do not answer if it knocks twice." It had knocked once. By the rule, I was permitted to answer. I hadn't answered, but not because of the rule. I hadn't answered because it was 8:40 at night. I was 14 miles from the nearest road, and no one should have been at my door. I checked the locks. I went to bed. I didn't sleep well, but I slept. In the morning, I went outside and looked at the landing. It had snowed lightly overnight, maybe half an inch, and the landing was covered. There were no footprints that I could see, but the snow would have covered them. I couldn't draw any conclusions from that. I noted it and moved on. 4 days later, December 1st, it happened again. This time at 7:15 in the evening, earlier. I was in the kitchen. 3 knocks. Quick, evenly spaced, maybe half a second between each. Knock, knock, knock. Firm, confident. The kind of knocking that expects an answer. I walked to the door. I stood behind it and listened. Silence. I waited. I looked through the window. Nothing visible. Darkness, snow, the faint shapes of the trees. After about 2 minutes, I said hello. Not loudly, just at a normal speaking volume. No response. 3 knocks, not 2. By the rule, 3 knocks were not the prohibited pattern. 3 knocks were, technically, fine. I could have opened the door. I want to state this clearly because it becomes important later. At this point, I was already referencing the rule. I was already using it as a framework for decision-making, even though I had dismissed it initially, even though Dale had essentially told me it was meaningless. Within 2 weeks of the first knock, I was consulting the rule. Not because I believed in it, because it was there. Because when you hear something you can't explain, any structure, even an absurd one, feels better than no structure at all. I didn't open the door. I told myself it was practical caution, not superstition. I went back to the kitchen. I finished eating. I went to bed. The next morning, I checked the landing again. This time there had been no fresh snow. The landing was clear. There were no prints. The ground around the landing, which was a mix of frozen dirt and old compressed snow, showed no disturbance. I walked the perimeter of the building. Nothing. No tracks, no marks, no sign that anything had stood at my door 8 hours earlier and knocked 3 times. That was when I started keeping a log. I took one of the blank field notebooks from the supply closet and I began recording each event. Date, time, number of knocks, spacing, volume, duration, ambient conditions, my response, and any observations the following morning. I told myself it was the rational thing to do. I was a caretaker at a research station. Observation and documentation were part of the job. I was being methodical. I was not being afraid. December 4th, 9:10 in the evening. 1 knock. Soft. Almost tentative. I was upstairs in the bedroom. I heard it clearly even through the floor. I did not go downstairs. I lay in bed and listened. Nothing more. December 8th, 6:50 in the evening. 5 knocks, unevenly spaced. The first 2 were close together, then a pause of maybe 2 seconds, then 3 more in quick succession. It sounded almost like a stumble, like someone losing their rhythm. I went to the door. I stood behind it. I listened. I said hello again. Nothing. December 11th, 10:20 at night. 4 knocks. Slow, deliberate, evenly spaced, about 1.5 seconds apart. Louder than the previous ones. I was in the main room. I remember looking at the door and having the very clear thought that the wood was vibrating slightly with each knock, that whatever was making contact with the door had enough force to transfer energy into the structure of it. This was not the wind. This was not ice cracking. This was directed, physical contact with the surface of the door. I did not answer. December 14th, 11:05 at night. 1 knock, the loudest yet. A single concussive impact that I felt in my chest. I was in bed. I sat up. My heart was going hard. I waited. Nothing followed. Just the 1 knock, and then the silence flooding back in. December 18th, 8:30 in the evening. 7 knocks. Rapid, almost frantic, like someone drumming their fingers on the door in irritation. They lasted about 3 seconds. Then they stopped. I was keeping meticulous records. I was reading and rereading the entries, and I began to notice something. The knocking had occurred 6 times over 21 days. The count each time was 1, 3, 1, 5, 4, 1, and then 7. None of these were 2. At no point had whatever was knocking at the door knocked exactly twice. 1 knock, yes. 3, 4, 5, 7, yes. Never 2. I thought about this for a long time. The rule said not to answer if it knocks twice. The rule did not say anything about other numbers. The implication, the logical structure of the rule, was that 2 knocks were the dangerous condition. 2 knocks meant do not open. By omission, other patterns were less threatening, or at least not explicitly prohibited. But the thing had never knocked twice. I sat in the main room on December 19th, and I stared at the binder, and I thought, what is the purpose of a rule that prohibits a thing that doesn't happen? There were several possible explanations, and I went through them carefully, because I am a careful person, or I was. First, coincidence. Maybe the thing, whatever it was, sometimes knocked twice, and sometimes didn't, and I simply hadn't been there long enough to encounter the 2 knock pattern. The sample size was small. 6 events was nothing. Maybe in January it would knock twice, and then the rule would become relevant. Second, the rule was outdated. Maybe whatever used to knock twice no longer did. Maybe the rule had been written in 1989 for a condition that no longer existed, and the current knocking was something different entirely, something the rule didn't cover. Third, the rule was wrong. Maybe it had always been wrong. Maybe it was a mistake, or a lie, or a misunderstanding passed down through the binder uncritically for 35 years. Fourth, and this was the one that kept me awake, maybe the thing knocking at the door knew the rule. I want to be careful about how I phrase this. I am not saying I believed the knocking entity was intelligent. I am not saying I had a theory about what it was. I am saying that the pattern of knocking was conspicuous in its avoidance of the one number I had been told to fear. 1, 3, 5, 4, 7. Every number but 2. As if 2 were being withheld. As if the absence of 2 was itself a message. And if the absence was deliberate, then the thing outside the door was aware of the rule, and it was choosing not to trigger it. Which meant the rule wasn't protecting me from the thing. The rule was the thing's way of staying in a category I wouldn't respond to. I want to pause here and describe what it is like to have this thought at 11 o'clock at night in a building alone in the middle of a frozen wilderness. It isn't dramatic. There's no surge of terror, no gasp, no moment of cinematic realization. It's quieter than that. It's the feeling of looking at something you've been looking at for weeks and suddenly seeing it differently. Like those optical illusions where the vase becomes 2 faces, except you can't unsee it. The rule had been a wall between me and fear, and then I realized the wall had a door in it, and the door was open, and it had always been open. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the main room with the wood stove going and the lights on, and I listened. Nothing knocked. The silence was enormous. On December 20th, I did my radio check-in. The Forest Service dispatcher was a woman named Karen. I'd spoken with her twice a week since November. She was professional and efficient. The check-ins were brief. I gave the weather data, confirmed the generator was operational, confirmed no emergencies. On December 20th, I asked her a question I hadn't planned to ask. I said, "Karen, do you know anything about the supplemental guidelines in the caretaker binder? The old ones, from '89? There was a pause. She said she wasn't familiar with the binder's contents in detail. She said I should contact Dale if I had questions about station procedures. I said it wasn't about procedures exactly. It was about a note regarding knocking at the door. There was another pause, longer this time. She said she didn't know anything about that and suggested I contact Dale. Her voice was the same as always, professional, efficient, but the pauses were unusual. Karen did not normally pause. I let it go. I said everything was fine. I signed off. I thought about calling Dale on the satellite phone, but what would I say? Something is knocking at my door every few days, and I'm concerned because it isn't knocking the right number of times. I could hear how that would sound. I left the satellite phone in the emergency cache. December 22nd, the solstice, the shortest day. Sunrise at 7:52, sunset at 4:21. 8 hours and 29 minutes of light. I spent the daylight hours outside because I had begun to feel uncomfortable in the building, and I wanted to be in open space where I could see in every direction. I split wood. I didn't need to. There was enough wood. I split it anyway because the axe and the motion and the sound were real, and real things were becoming important to me. That evening, at 6:15, the knocking came. 9 knocks. Steady, rhythmic, spaced exactly 1 second apart. I counted. I was already counting every time. I stood at the door and I put my hand against it, flat, palm on the wood, and I felt each knock translate through the door into my skin. The impacts were centered. Whatever was knocking at the exact center of the door, about chest height. The force was consistent. Each knock was identical to the last. Metronomic, like a machine, like something that did not tire. It stopped after 9. I kept my hand on the door. The wood was warm from the inside heat. Outside, it was 4 degrees. If a person had been standing on that landing, knocking on that door, their knuckles would have been red. Their hand would have been shaking. These knocks did not shake. I took my hand off the door. I went to the kitchen. I poured a glass of water. I drank it. I poured another. I drank that. Then I opened the binder and I read the rule again. If knocking is heard at the exterior door after dark, do not answer if it knocks twice. 2 knocks in succession means do not open the door. Any other pattern, you may use your judgment, but do not answer 2 knocks. Any other pattern, you may use your judgment. I had been reading that sentence as permission, as in, other patterns are not necessarily dangerous, so you can decide for yourself. That was one reading, but there was another. Any other pattern, you may use your judgment, meaning, for other patterns, you are on your own. We are not protecting you from other patterns. The rule covers 2 knocks and 2 knocks only. Everything else is outside the scope of this protection. The rule wasn't a comprehensive safety system. It was a single specific prohibition surrounded by a vast field of ambiguity, and whatever was outside was operating entirely within the ambiguity. It had never once touched the one condition the rule addressed. It was moving through the space the rule didn't cover, the space where I was told to use my judgment. And my judgment, for weeks, had been to not open the door, which meant the rule was irrelevant. I was protecting myself not because of the rule, but in spite of it. The rule had given me nothing. It had given me a single condition to watch for, and that condition had never materialized. Everything that had happened, every knock, every instance, had been in the unprotected space. And I had been sitting here feeling safe because the rule hadn't been triggered, as if the rule's silence meant something, as if the absence of a 2-knock pattern meant I was okay. I was not okay. I understood that now. Christmas Day. I didn't mark it. I don't remember what I ate. I remember the knocking. It came at 5:40 in the evening, less than an hour after dark. A single knock. Then silence. Then, 40 minutes later, another single knock. Not 2 in succession. 2 events, separated by 40 minutes. Was that 2 knocks? Was it 1 and 1? Where was the boundary? What defined succession? How close together did 2 knocks need to be to constitute the prohibited pattern? This had not occurred to me before, and once it occurred to me, I could not stop thinking about it. The rule said 2 knocks in succession. In succession implied a sequence, a direct follow-on, one after the other. But it did not define the time frame. If 2 knocks a second apart were in succession, what about 2 knocks 10 seconds apart? 30 seconds? 40 minutes? At what interval did 2 knocks in succession become 2 separate incidents of 1 knock each? The rule was not just specific, it was specific in a way that dissolved under scrutiny. The more precisely I tried to apply it, the less precise it became. It had the shape of clarity, but the substance of vapor. It sounded like a rule. It functioned like a whole. December 27th. I did something I hadn't done before. After the knocking, 3 knocks at 7:50 in the evening, I went upstairs to the bedroom that faced the east side, the side with the main door, and I looked out the window. The window was directly above the entrance. If someone was standing on the landing, I should have been able to see the top of their head, or at least see them when they stepped away. I looked down. The landing was empty. The snow on the ground around the landing was undisturbed. The knocking had stopped maybe 40 seconds before I reached the window. 40 seconds. In 40 seconds, a person could walk perhaps 150 feet in snow, and there would be tracks. There were no tracks. There was no person. There was nothing on the landing, nothing near it, nothing moving anywhere in the range of my vision, which extended to the lakeshore and partway across the frozen lake in the moonlight. The landscape was empty. It was as empty as it had been every morning when I checked. Whatever was knocking was not leaving evidence of physical presence. It was not approaching the door. It was not departing the door. It was, as far as I could determine, only existing at the moment of contact with the door's surface and at no other time. I went back downstairs. I sat in my chair. I did not read. I just sat. January. The cold deepened. Lows around -20, sometimes -30. The lake was frozen completely now, a white plain extending to the far shore, which was invisible most days, lost in the haze of distance and blowing snow. The days were still very short. I maintained my routine, but the routine was beginning to feel like something I was hiding inside, the way you pull a blanket over your head as a child, knowing it offers no protection, but wanting the boundary. The knocking was now occurring almost every night, sometimes multiple times in a night. I filled pages in the notebook. I recorded everything. Here is a sample of entries from the first 2 weeks of January. January 2nd, 7:20 p.m. 3 knocks, even spacing, moderate force. Duration approximately 1.5 seconds. No subsequent sounds. Morning check, no tracks. January 3rd, 9:05 p.m. 1 knock, heavy. Felt vibration in floor joists. No subsequent sounds. Morning check, no tracks. January 5th, 6:40 p.m. 6 knocks. Irregular spacing, first 3 rapid, then a pause of approximately 4 seconds, then 3 more, slower. Duration, approximately 9 seconds. No subsequent sounds. Morning check, no tracks. January 5th, 11:15 p.m. 1 knock, very soft. Almost inaudible. Was in bed. Was not sure I heard it. Waited 20 minutes, nothing further. January 7th, 8:30 p.m. 14 knocks. Steady rhythm, approximately 1 per second. Longest sequence to date. Stopped abruptly. No subsequent sounds. Morning check, no tracks. January 8th, 7 p.m. exactly. 1 knock, then silence. 8 p.m. exactly. 1 knock, then silence. 9 p.m. exactly. 1 knock, then silence. Each knock identical in force and character. Hourly intervals. I stayed awake until midnight, but there was no 10 p.m. knock. 3 knocks total, spaced 1 hour apart. I recorded it as 3 separate events and also as a single event. I did not know which it was. January 10th, no knocking. January 11th, no knocking. January 12th, 6:15 p.m. I was in the kitchen. I heard what I thought was a knock, but it was so faint I couldn't be certain. I went to the door and listened. Nothing. I stood there for 10 minutes. Nothing. I went back to the kitchen. At 6:30, another faint sound. This time I was paying close attention. It didn't sound like knocking. It sounded like touching, like a palm being placed flat against the exterior of the door and then removed. A soft contact, not a strike. I recorded it as a knock with a question mark. January 13th, 7:40 p.m. The door handle moved. I need to describe this carefully. I was in the main room facing the door, which was about 15 feet away from my chair. The door was locked, deadbolt engaged, chain on. The handle was the lever type, not a knob, a horizontal lever that you push down to open. At 7:40, I saw the lever depress. It moved down approximately half an inch, as if weight had been applied to it from the outside, and then it stopped. It stayed in the depressed position for about 2 seconds. Then it returned to its original position, slowly, controlled. Not the way a handle moves when it's released. The way a handle moves when the force is being withdrawn gradually. There was no knocking associated with this event. The handle simply moved. This was not the rule. The rule was about knocking. The rule said nothing about handles. The rule said nothing about contact that was not a knock. And I realized, sitting in my chair watching the door, that the space the rule didn't cover was growing. The rule was a tiny island, and the water around it was rising. I began keeping the lights on all night. I know the guidelines said to keep exterior lights off, but I stopped following that guideline. I kept the main room lights on, and I kept the light by the door on, and I put a flashlight on the table beside my chair, and I left the wood stove door open, so the firelight fell across the floor. I was not sleeping well. I was sleeping in the chair in the main room, because I did not want to be upstairs, away from the door, unable to see it. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like the behavior of a person who is afraid of a door. I was afraid of a door. I am being honest about this. January 15th, 2 months in. I called Dale on the satellite phone. It was early evening, not yet dark. I had planned what I would say. I would be calm and specific. I would present the data. I would ask focused questions. Dale answered after several rings. I told him I'd been hearing knocking at the exterior door at night. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked if I'd seen anything, any animal activity, any sign of a bear that hadn't denned, anything like that. I said no. No tracks, no marks, no physical evidence at all. He was quiet again. Then he said it could be thermal expansion, the door frame contracting in the cold, popping. It was a common thing in old buildings, he said. I said the knocking was on the exterior surface of the door. It was directional. It was not the sound of wood contracting. He said sometimes ice falls from the eaves and hits the landing. I said the knocking occurred at chest height on the door itself and had consistent point of origin. He was quiet for a longer time then. I could hear him breathing. Then he said, "Are you sleeping all right?" That was the moment I understood Dale was not going to help me. Not because he didn't believe me. I think he did believe me. I think he believed me because his questions were too quick, too ready, as if he had prepared explanations for this call, as if he had been waiting for it. Thermal expansion, falling ice. These were not the responses of a man encountering a strange report for the first time. They were the responses of a man who had a script. And the script's purpose was not to explain the knocking. It was to give me a reason to stop asking about it. I said I was sleeping fine. thanked him. I hung up. January 17th. I read the rule again. I had read it dozens of times by now, but I read it again, and this time I focused on the first line. Winter Caretaker Supplemental Guidelines. Effective November 1989. Effective 1989. The rule was 36 years old. 36 winters of caretakers in this building. I was not the first person to hear the knocking. I could not have been. Dale's response confirmed that. The rule's existence confirmed that. Someone in 1989 or before had heard the knocking and had written the rule. They had decided that 2 knocks was the critical threshold. They had made that determination based on something, some experience, some event, some reason. But what reason? What had happened that made 2 the number? What had happened when someone opened the door to 2 knocks? Or, and I want to be careful here, what had happened when someone did not open the door to a different number of knocks? What if the rule was not about the 2-knock pattern being dangerous? What if the rule was about the 2-knock pattern being the only safe one? What if the instruction was inverted? Not do not answer 2 knocks because 2 knocks are dangerous, but do not answer 2 knocks because 2 knocks are the one thing we can tell you to refuse, and we cannot tell you about the rest. I was aware that I was potentially spiraling. I was aware that isolation and sleep deprivation can produce paranoid ideation. I was aware of all of this. I am aware of it now. But I was also looking at data, at a notebook full of entries, at a pattern that was too consistent to dismiss. The thing had never knocked twice. Out of dozens of events, across 2 months, through every possible variation of number and rhythm and spacing, it had never once produced a sequence of exactly 2 knocks. The probability of that, if the knocking were random, was vanishingly small. It was not random. The absence was structured. January 20th, the knocking stopped. It simply stopped. January 20th, 21st, 22nd, 23rd. No knocking, no handle movement, no sounds of any kind at the door. I sat in my chair each night, and I watched the door, and nothing happened. The silence, which had originally been the normal state, and which the knocking had interrupted, now felt like the interruption. The silence felt wrong. The silence felt like something waiting. On January 24th, I did something I cannot fully explain. I'm going to describe it as accurately as I can, and I am not going to editorialize it or justify it. At 9 in the evening, I got up from my chair, walked to the door, and knocked on it. From the inside. 2 knocks. I knocked on my own door, twice, from the inside. I don't know why I did it. I think I wanted to see if the pattern meant anything in the other direction. I think I wanted to produce the forbidden number myself, to take the rule out of the passive and put it into the active, to make the 2-knock pattern exist, because nothing else would. I think I wanted to assert some kind of agency over a situation that had reduced me to a recording device, sitting in a chair, logging phenomena I couldn't control. I knocked twice. Then I stood there with my hand on the door, and I listened. After about 10 seconds, something knocked back. Once. 1 knock. From outside, directly opposite where my hand was touching the door. I felt it through the wood. Not loud, not aggressive, responsive, like an answer. I took my hand off the door. I stepped back. I stood in the middle of the main room. My heart was going so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. The thing had responded to me. It had heard my 2 knocks, and it had responded with 1. Not 2, 1. Even in response, even in what seemed like a direct interaction, it would not produce 2 knocks. The avoidance was absolute. I went to my chair. I sat down. I did not move for the rest of the night. The knocking resumed the next night. January 25th, 7:30 p.m. 3 knocks. And with them came something new. After the knocking stopped, I heard another sound. It was very faint, and it came not from the door, but from the wall to the left of the door, the east wall, the one that faced the lake. It was a long, slow sliding sound, like something being drawn across the exterior surface of the wall, like a hand, or something shaped like a hand, being dragged across the clapboard siding. It lasted about 4 seconds, and it moved from left to right toward the corner of the building. I went to the window. I looked out. I saw nothing. But I noticed something else. The frost on the inside of the window, which had formed in its usual delicate pattern of crystals, had been disturbed. Not on the outside, on the inside. There were marks in the frost on the exterior surface of the glass. 3 lines, close together, running vertically through the frost. They were thin, about 3 inches long, evenly spaced. They looked like they had been drawn by a fingertip. I had not touched the window. I had not been near the window until that moment. I stared at the marks for a long time. Then I looked at the rest of the windows in the main room. There were 4 windows on the ground floor, 2 on the east wall, 1 on the north, 1 on the south. The frost on the other windows was undisturbed, only the window nearest the door. I got a cloth and I wiped the marks away. I wiped all the frost off the window. I told myself it could have been a draft, an inconsistency in the glass, a convection pattern from the wood stove. I told myself this while wiping the marks away very quickly, as if removing them would remove whatever had made them. The next morning, I examined the exterior of the building. The clapboard siding on the east wall showed no marks, no scratches, no indication that anything had been dragged across it. But the surface was rough and weathered, and it would be difficult to see subtle marks on it. I convinced myself of this explanation, and then I stopped looking. January 28th, I did my radio check-in. Karen answered as usual. I gave the weather data. I confirmed the generator was operational. Then I said, "Karen, how many caretakers has this station had?" She said she would have to check the records. I said, "How many have completed the full term? November to May?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I really couldn't say. You'd have to ask the university." I said, "Has anyone ever left early?" She said, "I don't have that information." I said, "Has anyone ever called in about knocking at the door?" She said, "I'd really recommend you speak with Dale about station-specific concerns." I said, "Karen, I'm asking you." There was a very long pause. Then she said, "The station has been continuously operated every winter since 1987. And then she said, "I really do need to go." And then the radio went silent. Continuously operated since 1987. That was 38 winters. 38 caretakers, or at least 38 winter terms. The rule had been written in 1989, the 3rd winter. Someone during the 2nd or 3rd winter had encountered the knocking and had written the rule. And every caretaker since had received the binder with the rule in it. And some number of them had heard the knocking. And some number of them had called Dale or his predecessor and been told about thermal expansion and falling ice. And some number of them had sat in this chair and watched this door and counted knocks and wondered why it was never 2. I was not the first. I want to repeat that. I was not the first person to go through this. The rule's existence proved it. The rule was a residue of someone else's experience, someone who had been here before me, someone who had listened to the knocking and tried to make sense of it, and had produced this single, inadequate, mysterious instruction. Do not answer if it knocks twice. That person had known something. They had decided that 2 was the significant number. They had written it down and put it in the binder, and it had survived 36 years. Whatever they knew, whatever had led them to that specific instruction, it was encoded in the rule, but the code was incomplete. The rule was a message from 1989, and I couldn't read it, and there was no one to ask. Or maybe the rule was not a message. Maybe the rule was a test. Maybe the purpose of the rule was not to protect the caretaker, but to see what the caretaker would do. Would they follow the rule? Would they question it? Would they open the door? Would they not? Maybe the rule was an experiment, and I was a subject, and the knocking was a variable, and the whole thing, the station, the winter, the isolation, was a controlled environment in which someone was measuring my response to a rule that didn't quite fit the phenomenon it claimed to address. I am aware of how this sounds. I am aware that this is the kind of thinking that isolation produces. But I could not stop, because the alternative to thinking was sitting in the chair and listening to the knocking and not thinking was worse. Not thinking meant accepting the knocking as a natural feature of my environment, and I could not do that because it was not natural. It was deliberate. It was patterned. It avoided the number 2 with a consistency that was not random. February. The days were getting slightly longer. Not enough to feel, but enough to measure. I was still maintaining the weather instruments. I was still logging data. I was still functioning outwardly as a competent caretaker. My radio check-ins were normal. I gave the data. I said nothing about the knocking. I had learned that asking about it produced only deflection, and deflection was its own kind of information. The people who managed this station knew about the knocking. They had known for decades. They had put a rule in the binder, and they had instructed each caretaker to follow it. And when the caretaker called to ask about it, they had a set of explanations ready that explained nothing. This was not negligence. This was management. The knocking was being managed, and I was being managed, and the rule was one of the tools of management. I want to describe what the rule had done to me, psychologically, because I think it is the most important part of this account, more important than the knocking itself. The rule had given me a framework. 2 knocks equals danger. Other patterns, use your judgment. This framework had organized my fear. It had given my fear a shape, a boundary, a condition. I was afraid of 2 knocks. I was not afraid, or I was less afraid, of other numbers. The rule had sorted the unknown into 2 categories, the specifically prohibited and the generally ambiguous. And I had clung to this sorting with a desperate, unexamined faith, because the alternative was unsorted fear, fear without a framework, fear of everything. But the thing had never knocked twice. It had operated exclusively in the ambiguous category, the use your judgment category, the category the rule did not protect me from. And over time, the ambiguous category had become the entire space of my experience. The rule's protection was nominal. It protected me from a scenario that had never occurred and showed no indication of ever occurring. Meanwhile, everything that was actually happening, all the knocking, all the sounds, all the handle movement, all the marks on the frost, was happening in the space the rule had left unaddressed. The rule hadn't protected me. It had blinded me. It had focused my attention on a specific threat, 2 knocks, and while I was watching for that specific threat, everything else had been able to approach freely, because everything else was in the category of use your judgment, and my judgment, guided by the rule, had been that if it isn't 2 knocks, it's probably fine. It was not fine. I knew it was not fine, but I had let it happen, night after night, because the rule had given me a way to categorize each event as not the dangerous one. February 8th. Something changed. I was in the main room. It was about 8 in the evening. The knocking came. I had my notebook ready. I was counting. 1, then a pause, then another. 2 knocks. My pen stopped. My breath stopped. I sat there, completely still, staring at the door, and I thought, that was 2. That was 2 knocks. The rule applies. Do not open the door. And then I felt something I did not expect. Relief. Enormous, flooding relief. Because the rule was finally relevant. The thing had finally done the thing I was told to watch for. The system was working. The rule was engaged. I had a clear instruction, and the instruction was, do not open the door. And I was not going to open the door, and for the first time in months, I felt a sense of clarity, of alignment between the rule and reality. I sat there for maybe 10 minutes, just breathing, just feeling the relief of having a rule that applied. And then the knocking came again. A third knock, identical to the first two. Same force, same location, same timbre. And the relief collapsed. 3 knocks, not 2. The first 2 had been followed by a third. The sequence was 3, not 2. I had heard 2 and stopped counting, and then the third had come, and the total was 3, and 3 was not the prohibited pattern. But for a moment, between the second knock and the third, the rule had been active. For a moment, the condition had been met. 2 knocks in succession. The rule said, do not open. And then the third knock had retroactively reclassified the event. It was no longer 2 knocks. It was 3. The rule no longer applied. I stared at my notebook. I put the pen down. I picked it up again. I didn't know what to write. I didn't know how to record an event that had been one thing and then become another. The rule operated on completed sequences, but I was experiencing the knocks in real time, one at a time, and in real time, after the second knock, the rule had been triggered. The third knock had untriggered it. Was that possible? Could a rule be triggered and then untriggered? Was the rule's condition evaluated continuously, or only after the sequence ended? And how did you know when the sequence ended? After the third knock, I waited. I waited 15 minutes. No fourth knock came, so the final count was 3. But I hadn't known that at the time. At the time, after the second knock, I had not known whether a third was coming. For several seconds, I had been in a state where the rule applied, and then I wasn't. I think this was deliberate. I think the thing outside the door had given me 2 knocks, and then waited, let me feel the rule engage, let me experience the relief of clarity, and then had knocked a third time to take it away. I think it was showing me something about the rule. I think it was showing me that the rule could be activated and deactivated, that the boundary between the prohibited and the permitted was not a wall but a line in sand, and that it could step over it and step back whenever it chose. After that night, I stopped trusting the rule entirely, not because I believed it was false, but because I understood it was insufficient. The rule was a single point in a vast space. It addressed one pattern out of an infinite number of possible patterns. It was like being told, do not go outside if the temperature is exactly 31 degrees. What about 30? What about 32? What about every other temperature? The rule's specificity was its failure. It was so precise that it was meaningless. And yet, I could not abandon it. Even knowing it was insufficient, even understanding that it had been a psychological tool rather than a protective measure, I could not let it go. Because the rule was all I had. The rule was the only structure between me and the raw, unsorted fear of a door that knocked. Without the rule, every knock was equal. Every knock was unknown. Every knock was potentially the one that meant something terrible, and I had no way to differentiate. The rule, broken as it was, had at least given me a way to sort. Without it, I was left with a flat, undifferentiated field of dread, and that was worse. That was so much worse. February. I cannot give you precise dates for all of what follows because my record-keeping deteriorated. The notebook entries become less detailed, less organized. Some pages have only a time and a number. Some pages have only a question mark. Some pages I don't remember writing. The knocking continued. It came every night now, sometimes multiple times. The patterns were varied. I recorded 3, 1, 5, 8, 1, 4, 11, 1, 6, 3, 1, 1, 1, never 2, still never 2. Except that once, on the 8th, and then the third knock had come and cancelled it. It had shown me 2 and then taken it away, and it had not shown me 2 again. The sliding sounds along the exterior walls became more frequent. They were no longer confined to the east wall. I heard them on the north wall, the south wall. One night, I heard something on the roof. Not footsteps, not walking. A slow dragging sound that moved from one end of the roof to the other, directly above the bedroom where I no longer slept. It took about 20 seconds to cross the full length of the building. Then it stopped. Then, about a minute later, it crossed.